Hello, everyone, and welcome to Black Issues Forum. I'm Deborah Holt-Noel, and I'm excited to be here at the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh, where the museum has partnered with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission to present a film by the Smithsonian Channel called The Green Book Guide to Freedom. It's a fascinating story about a Harlem postal worker named Victor Green who developed a guidebook for African American travelers, and it also provides insight into how African Americans moved and the power of Black mobility. We're going to talk about it today with a very exciting panel of experts in travel and heritage tourism. I'd like to introduce them right now. Please welcome Aya Shabu. She's a professional dancer, choreographer, and teaching artist in Durham and founder of Whistle Stop Tours. We also have Nabors, Partner Relations Manager for Visit North Carolina, a part of the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina. And we also have Angela Thorpe, Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you for being here.
You know, we've seen this incredible documentary about the Green Book and about Black mobility, and it's so important, the film says, to preserve spaces that were once reserved for African Americans for historical purposes. But I want to start with you, Aya, and share with us some of the work that you're doing to do exactly that with your Whistle Stop Tours. What are they?
Yes. So I've been fortunate to work with the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, which is located in Durham. This is the home of Pauli Murray, who is a famed lawyer, writer, first African-American ordained Episcopal priest, activist, so many things. And her house was named as a National Historic Landmark in 2016. So I get to partner with the Pauli Murray Center to enliven not only the house in which Pauli Murray grew up, but also the neighborhood that is still standing, and the stories of African Americans who remember when the West End was a segregated neighborhood. And they're still working to preserve their stories as more people are moving to North Carolina, specifically to Durham, into once was historically Black neighborhoods, and are now being integrated and in some cases gentrified.
Well, as many people know, many people may not realize that tourism is a great economic driver in North Carolina. So Angela, talk a little bit about your work in terms of the importance of lifting up spaces that have a historical connection and how that work impacts travelers who are African American and otherwise.
Absolutely. So we find in no matter what heritage we're thinking about, place is important. Stories are important, our objects and our memories are important. And so you see in historic homes all across the state and historic sites and even in museums, these are places where people can go to, again, connect to heritage, to connect to memory, and to connect to history. In North Carolina, we have a number of African American heritage sites that, again, drive people to them. You can think of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. You can think of the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture in Charlotte, North Carolina, or even Stagville State Historic Site, which was once a large plantation in Durham, North Carolina. Again, all of these places do a wonderful job of capturing memory and driving people to visit them. And again, this is an economic engine for many of these communities, because when people are going to visit these sites, they're spending their dollars in the gift shop, at nearby restaurants, and even in hotels. And so we can understand how African American heritage tourism can create ripple effects in communities across the state of North Carolina.
And I'd like to ask you pretty much the same question, Andre, because when we think about our history, there is certainly can be a negative memory attached, especially when you think about African American history. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see, if any difference, the appeal of heritage and historical tourism with regard to African American tourists and travelers versus other travelers?
Well, I think telling that whole story, whether it's a tough story to tell or it's a great story to tell, I think when you look at tourism and people that are traveling, they want that whole story. And you don't want to leave anything out. I think that's a very, very bad effect. That could have a very, very negative effect, more so than just the story itself. So being able to tell that story and get that information out there, whether it's good or bad, heritage tourists want that real, authentic piece of history. And one of the biggest reasons why they go to particular locations is they want that real, authentic history.
So what we're seeing, I wanted to ask you, in your experience, both in North Carolina and also West Virginia and other places, are you seeing the same kind of interest in this heritage tourism? And is it created, does it need to have a different kind of appeal for African American tourists?
I think for African Americans, tourism, they really kind of look at their heritage, so they want to know more about their heritage. But tourism in general, I mean, we go to spas, we go to games, we go to events, we go to festivals, so it's one of those things that it appeals to all. But I think, for African American travelers and that heritage tourism, they do have a kind of a focus on the historic connotations that resonate with us.
Let's talk a little bit about an issue that really came up in this documentary, and that is safety in travel. A lot of African Americans have had to deal with safety when it comes to travel from the time that African Americans arrived in America, all the way through Jim Crow, through segregation, certainly continuing through civil rights, and even the 90s. Here in North Carolina, we even had legislation, driving while black, that pertained to a protection when it comes to using the highways to travel. So I wanted to ask the question, how do you think that African Americans are traveling today? Do you think that the safety factor is affecting how we move about spaces? Let me open up with you, Angela.
I absolutely do. When African Americans move their bodies about the country or even about the state of North Carolina, there are markers and experiences, right, that sometimes render people to feel unsafe. Some of those markers are subtle. Some of those markers are explicit. You can think of flags you see, of signs you see. And again, sometimes you enter spaces and you might experience microaggressions. You might experience outright racism or discrimination. And so I think that these are realities that African Americans certainly are facing today. Because of that reality, I think people are mindful of how they travel, right? You still have folks who kind of map out where they're going to go. You still have folks who try to gather or glean where are the oasis spaces or safe spaces where they can be serviced. And again, there's still a concerted effort to really be thoughtful about how we're moving our body from place to place in this state, in this country, and in the world.
Aya, have you noticed a difference, or as you were being raised, as you grew up, have you made any kind of connections after seeing the film about the places that you choose to travel, how you travel? Has there been an impact on the way that we've had to travel as African Americans in the past to how you do it today, and how the people who you interact with do that today?
Absolutely. I focus a lot on walking because that's the basis of my work, walking tours. And I think about the way that the black body has to perform in certain spaces, even public spaces. So public spaces can be disciplinary and prohibitive for black bodies. I was on tour, and in 2012, upon the death of Trayvon Martin, I remember seeing signs everywhere about who could go into which gas stations wearing what. So there were signs like no hoodies allowed, but I knew who those signs were really meant for. They weren't talking about everyone wearing hoodies. They were really targeting black people. And so in my own lifetime, I have had to adjust the way that I show up in spaces.
That's so interesting. Andre, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
No, absolutely. When I attend different trade shows or consumer shows, I get some of those questions all the time. The folks that are coming in about, hey, I want to come to North Carolina, or I want to, go to this beach, or I want to go to this attraction. How safe is it? Will I be welcome? I get those questions. Sometimes quite often. The great thing is that in my experience, these places are very safe and very appealing, I think, for African Americans and for all travelers, for that matter. But even for myself, I'm a husband, I'm a father. I even make long plans myself and have to make sure that, hey, when I'm taking my family somewhere, I want to make sure that they're safe wherever we go. So it is an impact, and I think a lot of travelers, particularly African American travelers, have to sit down and plan that out, their trips, as Angela even stated before. They plan that out when they decide that they're going someplace to travel.
And I'd like to add a little something. I think it's really interesting to think about the tools that people use to do this type of planning, right? To do this type of research. As a young person, as a millennial, I connect deeply, right, to the digital world and the digital realm. And so when I'm planning travels with my friends or even my family, I'm going to Black travel bloggers to see what they say. And oftentimes they are documenting their experiences. They are telling you maybe where they had not so positive encounter or where they felt safe. And so there are a number of tools out there that are actively being used and engaged to do that active type of research around finding safe spaces as you travel.
That's true, because in the same way that technology and advancements helped African Americans to travel in the past, they're beginning, these same kinds of advancements help, I think, African Americans to experience more spaces differently and even more. I'm thinking specifically about Uber and Lyft, and how that's impacted, I would say, a lot of African American travels, not only here in America, but worldwide. Because so many African American men in particular have shared with me, and you can weigh in on this, Andre, the difficulty of just getting from point A to B, flagging down a cab, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it is unfortunately difficult in certain places, but I think again, the research that you have to do, the planning that you have to do, I think that's just a major thing that we have to consider when we're making that plan for travel.
I'd also like to add, just around this idea of safety, turning the lens on the neighborhoods, because I concern myself oftentimes with the safety of the people who live there, living in this age where folks feel like they could be displaced. And so there's oftentimes even mistrust with opening up their historic neighborhood, knowing that history adds value, and value that they can't always access because of an oppressive and segregated history.
And what's interesting too, I think, is in the work that even I do, I get to host a program about travel in North Carolina, and there is a great and deep fascination with historic places, especially when there is a place that's old or historic and now it's been renovated.
Yes.
And now you can go and you can learn about the history of this place in a modern atmosphere. And so when I saw the documentary and some of the places that are historic, but there haven't been the resources to build them back up and make them these attractive destinations, that's a real challenge. And I was wondering what you think about why the resources aren't necessarily there to build these spaces up, these previously Black-owned spaces back up, so that people can know the history and enjoy these spaces today.
I'd like to weigh in on that a little bit. I think a lot of it is, I don't think that history is being put out to maybe some of our younger generation as much. I know my grandfather, my great-grandmother, whenever we sat down, that's all I heard was about where they grew up, how they grew up, what they did, places that they've gone. So I don't think that it's brought out as much, and maybe it's not something that maybe we feel is important anymore because there's other things that we can do now. But when I see things like that, I just see project in the making. I mean, it just turns all the wheels are running about where are some of the resources that we can go to? Who can we partner with to help save some of these places? Where can we go? Who can we pull together? Think about all of these athletes and musicians and all those folks out there with resources and access to others with resources. There's a major opportunity, I think, out there for all of us to kind of tap into that and say, hey, somebody take this first step and just say, hey, we're going to save this one location here, and let's make a plan and let's pull it together, which trickles on down to the next location. It trickles on down to the next location. So I just think it's a matter of, you know, myself or all of us, if we just take that stand, I believe, and put ourselves out there, and you know, just like they did in the civil rights movement. I mean, you have to take that stand and put yourself out there, and I think good things can happen from that.
And I would say it takes the interests of not just African Americans, but this is our community's history, and it provides that rich, full story that everyone can appreciate. And Angela, I know that you are very probably close to a lot of this kind of work. I'm thinking about the Nina Simone birthplace, and that house still exists. I don't know what, I know that a group of African Americans purchased that property, but what's to happen next, and where is the interest to generate the resources needed to really build it up?
Right. I think the Nina Simone birthplace is a really good example of exactly what Andre is talking about. And part of what I wanted to add is that in addition to there being a resource gap, I think there's an education gap, right? Do people understand all that it takes to, preserve a home, right? Or to restore a community? It's a lot of work. And again, that Nina Simone house is a really great example. Again, 4 artists of color from New York City purchased that home and then approached the National Trust for Historic Preservation, one of the leading historic preservation organizations in the nation, for help. They said, hey, can you help us preserve this space? And that's exactly what the trust has come in to do. They designated that space with a pretty robust designation that built awareness around the property. Using that awareness, they were able to do education around this is what it's going to take to restore it. They're doing education in the digital realm, if you will. They're doing education with stakeholders across the state and people in the neighborhood. So everyone is engaged around what it takes to restore that home. And the trust, again, is great in that because they're such a large organization, they are able to connect to people who have the resources to help them preserve the home. They're able to lead these fundraising campaigns to help fundraise the home, and they're able to connect to industry experts with the expertise and the technical skills to actually do the work of preserving the home. So again, there are a number of steps that it takes to even do basic preservation, and so they are leading a really wonderful model in our state around doing active education. And I'm hoping that that education helps to inspire, empower, and mobilize other communities across the state and people across the state to do the same thing.
And I think that there's a lot of really exciting places like that right in Durham.
Yes, so I'm part of the education or edutainment, as we call it, industry, and the walks are an opportunity for people to connect with the history, connect with memory. I mean, if it isn't for those places, we may not remember the stories because all memory happens somewhere, right? It happened in a bedroom or it happened at the beach, right? And so we need place in order to really recall those memories. And so Whistle Stop Tours is all about engaging people, but not just about reliving and retelling the past. It's really about engaging audiences so that they can begin to imagine what future could look like for this community or for this historic site.
What's really popular right now is retro. So I see a lot of, especially like downtown Raleigh, oh, we're going to go and take it back to the 1960s look. So that's really in vogue, in particular, I think, for a number of millennials these days.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so.
And I know we've talked a little bit about safety and about these different places. What are your thoughts about what African American travelers are looking for when it comes to the travel industry? African Americans are great consumers, and I wanted to know what your thoughts, what you've observed about how African Americans as consumers of travel has impacted the industry. Andre?
Well, we're about a $63 billion economic impact to the travel industry. Actually, African Americans are actually one of the largest spenders when it comes to trips. They spend about $2,000 on an average trip.
So we're traveling, and we're spending, we're
yes.
out there.
And we're definitely out there and doing months of different things. Again, travel, going to spas, events, historic sites, shopping is another. Shopping and dining are probably the two largest contributors or influencers for African Americans to travel, and for all travelers for that matter. So we're definitely having a major impact on the industry, particularly with our dollars.
And then are we enjoying some of the benefits of that impact? I'm thinking about when it comes to the power of travel and the tourism industry. We are apparently participating as consumers. How much are we enjoying the benefit of ownership of hotels, ownership of restaurants? Because when you have that ownership, you can then turn and have an impact on the development of community.
And it's probably very little. As far as particularly for ownership, many of our historic sites that aren't state-run may be owned and operated by African Americans, but for the most part, probably that economic impact doesn't reach our community as much as it does for some of your more downtown destinations. But I do feel like there's an opportunity there. So there's an opportunity that we can capitalize on the history that we have, and we have to be the ones that tell that story. We're the ones that know that story, we know it the best, and we have to make sure that we're the ones that tell that story. So there's opportunity there for us to capture that part of that $63 billion that's being generated into the income, into the economic threshold.
And Angela, I think to your point, as you were talking earlier about the Nina Simone House, that when there's the interest and the investment of time, it takes an investment of time and resources to go into, say, what appears to be a blighted neighborhood. But there might be some really rich history there. You see something falling down, you take a look at some of the hotels and things that were featured in the documentary, and you can walk away saying, oh, it looks like blight. It looks like they need to fix that up. But it's not they. It looks like somebody, including we all, need to invest in that heritage, in that history.
Absolutely, and we have a couple of great examples of some of that work that is happening across the state. Of course, we've talked about the Nina Simone birthplace in Tryon, North Carolina. Another space that is really impressive to me is the Magnolia House in Greensboro, North Carolina. Magnolia House was once a Green Book site. It was a hotel, and it hosted the best of the best, right? Jackie Robinson stayed there. Singers, dancers, entertainers of all sorts. And that space was purchased in the 90s, and now I can say that it's being revitalized. The family that owns that home is doing a lot of work to renovate and restore the space. They're doing a lot of work to reactivate it in the hopes of kind of turning it back into what it was in its heyday. Additionally, there is a bed and breakfast near Shelby, North Carolina called the Villa at Water's Edge. It's a historic property that was restored by a Black woman. And again, this is a very active and popular B&B where those African American or tourism dollars in general are going back into that space. Again, that is a Black-owned space. So we're seeing that happen, but I'm like, Andre, I'd like to see more of that happen. And that's something that the two of us actually talk about very, very deeply.
Yeah.
Yes, we strategize often around how to drive Black dollars back to the state, particularly as it relates to African American heritage tourism.
And speaking about opportunity, it's a great opportunity for artists and entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So we're, already working on a shoestring budget, and so we can take a place that isn't in use or is in disrepair and turn it into a performance space, or use the wall as a mural. And it doesn't matter that it's temporary, because that engagement of community to create something, whether it lasts for 10 years or 10 days, is a galvanizing point for community to come together and begin to look at their community in new ways and think about, what do we want this to look like, and know that we have the capacity to do that, because we've just made this. Just that they didn't exist, hours ago.
I think a little bit earlier you mentioned that some communities are undergoing gentrification. How does this impact the ability to maintain a heritage, preserve a heritage, and to tell the story, particularly the African American story?
Yeah, so some of my biggest clients are gentrifiers. They're newcomers. The numbers say that we have about 20 people moving to Durham a day. And this is the professional class of people. And a lot of them are white middle class millennials. And so when they come on my walk, I want to root them not only in the history, but their connection to that history. So everyone who comes is coming with an identity, they're coming with a culture, they're coming with a history, they're coming with privilege, they're coming with bias. And so how do you actively engage with the past, knowing who you are? And so my hope is that folks walk away feeling that they now have information that they may not have had before, that they can use to transform first themselves, and then maybe get involved in that community.
What excites each of you the most about traveling, particularly in North Carolina? What do you look for? You've shared a little bit, Andre. You can share a little bit more if you like. But what do you look for, and what are your colleagues looking for in their travel experience, in their leisure time experience?
For me, I look for diversity. Because I like a little bit of everything. I like a little bit of outdoors. I like to golf. I like to fish. But I have daughters. I'm the oldest son, but I have daughters, so they do a lot of the spa and the makeup stuff with their mother. I like
I'm for that.
Yeah, oh yeah. But I like a little bit of diversity, so I like to kind of experience a little bit of everything. One, just because it's something I like to do, but for my job as well, being able to understand the different nuances of each section of tourism, whether it's outdoor recreation, whether it's walking trails, whether it's biking trails, whether it's historic sites, historic trails, the different types of food. Food lover of all types.
And there are a lot of North Carolina towns that are now foodie towns.
Big time.
Durham in particular.
Durham in particular. So I really like to see a kind of a variety of different things to experience, and then I can actually go out and share those experiences with maybe those who haven't had a chance to experience that as well. As a transplant into North Carolina from West Virginia to North Carolina, I have a lot to learn. It's a large state, so it's still a lot to learn. But it seems like every day I seem to find something different and something new that I could experience and share with others.
This is a fun state. Aya?
I'm also a transplant from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I've been here about 17 years, definitely starting with food, and thinking about what does food tell us about the place? What does it tell us about the history, where the food came from? I'm also really interested in the vegetation. When I look around, I'm enthralled by the cotton fields. That's something that I only would read about as someone from the north and with family from Barbados, but to actually see cotton, and then it just makes me, all the history just opens up for me, and I think about the enslaved, and I think about the labor, I think about the domestic slave trade, about the millions of African Americans who built this country. I love the tobacco leaf. It's a gorgeous, verdant plant, and we oftentimes only think of it as a controlled substance. And we don't really honor the legacy of the cultivators of this land, the first cultivators of this land, the indigenous folk, the Ino and the Okanichi, right? And their practices and traditions with this medicinal and spiritual plant. And so I love discovering the past in the present.
I really love what you said about cotton and tobacco, because so often I encounter African Americans who say that they are offended when they see a tuft of cotton. And when I travel about, there are so many places in our state that use that as a form of decoration, and it can be very beautiful. But there is this, I think, conflict with seeing this. But I love the way that you explain and share how there is pride in the cotton. There's pride in the tobacco and in the fields, because there are people who worked hard and made a craft out of it, even under the harshest of circumstances.
Yeah. Indeed.
So when I travel, I look for heritage, art, and culture. I think those are pretty much the three things that really help communicate the identity of a place, right? Or at least help to root you a little bit more deeply in the identity of a place. And so, again, I'm seeking to go somewhere where they've got an art museum, or I can go to their historic site or historic home and learn a little bit more about local culture. Of course, I agree with both Andre and Aya around food is an absolute must. And then the last thing is experiences, right? Speaking of food, am I going somewhere where maybe I can take a cooking class, or what is the opportunity that is going to allow for me to take the most selfies, right? I think experiences are really important, especially to young people, as we some of us are digital natives, or some of us are very deeply connected to the digital age. And so that plays a very big role in how we see the world, how we choose to travel, and how we choose to navigate travel.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank you, Angela Thorpe, I'd like to thank you, Aya Shabu, Angela Thorpe, and Andre Nabors for coming out and sharing your thoughts about travel in North Carolina. And I'd like to thank all of you for watching Black Issues Forum. If you'd like to know more information about today's program, visit us online at unctv.org. For Black Issues Forum, I'm Deborah Holt-Noel. Thank you for spending your time with us. And now, I'd actually like to invite our audience to ask any questions if you have, or make any comments if you'd like to. So, I mean, are there any, we have a microphone right over there, if you wouldn't mind, so that we can make sure that we do hear your question. The introduction.
Hi.
Thank you so much. We're going to make sure that we have the light on you. Is there a light on her, and is her mic up? Oh, no, don't go away. She's ready.
Hi, so I just had a quick question. As an educator, one of the things that I've learned is this history is not being taught in schools. And being of a different culture, like, I find it very hard to try to get the children really to understand that this impacts us, and it's impacting us even in society today. How would you go about maybe bringing this into the school culture so the kids can understand it from a different perspective? From a teacher, it's just like, oh, you have to teach us this. But how would you maybe try to incorporate this into something that we could teach into a classroom?
That's a great question, and immediately I'm thinking about the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Memorial Institute and great field trips, but I'm going to let you address this question, Angela.
Right, absolutely. So part of the work that the Commission does is connecting educators to the African American heritage assets that exist across the state of North Carolina. So we have resource guides and resource pages that, again, allow educators to connect to those spaces, and then we can do the extra step of connecting you to the people who run those spaces, right? So you can do field trips, so you can work with them around school programming. Furthermore, I'd like to use this Green Book as an example. Again, the African American Heritage Commission launched the North Carolina Green Book Project, if you will, in 2017. And the reason why part of this is happening is that we've just released a statewide traveling exhibit that connects to this history. As part of that traveling exhibit, we've got educator resources, we've got lesson plans, educational traveling trunks that we're placing all across the state so that our educators can check those out and bring that material and these histories into their classrooms. I know the North Carolina Museum of History has resources like this, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and so a number of your institutions have these resources packaged, if you will, but it is up to us to help you understand where to find them and how to connect them to you.
And it might be also a matter of sharing with your school boards the importance of really diversifying how education, how history is taught, because especially here in North Carolina, we have just a rich, diverse history that's inclusive of Native, of Latino, of African American, and that's from the very beginning. So, and I find it fascinating.
Very fascinating.
Do I have any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Angela, you mentioned the Green Book project. Can you just give us a brief overview of the Green Book sites in North Carolina?
Absolutely. So there were, during the Green Book's publication, 1936 to 1966, there were over 300 Green Book sites in the state of North Carolina. Charlotte claimed the most at 55, and most of the counties in North Carolina had Green Book sites. It's interesting because Durham is one of the spaces that has the least number of Green Book sites, and we think perhaps that's because people understood that to be a safe space already. Of those over 300 sites, today just around 60 are still standing. Some of those sites are currently at risk. Excelsior Club in Charlotte. Anyone familiar with that? Exactly, yes. And so that is a former Green Book site that, again, as you understand, has recently been in quite a bit of challenge and transition. And so it's part of the work of this project is to build awareness of these spaces so that we can mobilize local communities to help us save these spaces. About half a dozen of those original over 300 Green Book sites are still in operation as they were in the past. So again, 6 still operational out of over 300. Magnolia House in Greensboro, North Carolina being one of them, an auto service station in Durham being another.
Wow. Thank you.
Actually,
Great question.
If I can add to that, one of the things that we at Visit and See are working with Angela and the African American Heritage Commission is actually taking those sites that are still you're able to go and have an experience there, and working on putting together a marketing piece, a marketing tool, even if it starts off as digital, to where others can go and experience these places as well. So we're working kind of tandemly to make that available for anyone throughout the world, for that matter, to be able to come and experience those places. And hopefully, what we hope is that maybe that will send another spark to maybe look at some of those other locations and maybe spark some preservation efforts to where we can expand on that and have more where we can market and push out to those who want to visit.
Thank you.